Coming up.
Quote, the Prime Minister and Mr. Singh agreed to these important measures. Question, whose idea? Was it a Liberal idea or an NDP idea to change the date of the election so that soon-to-be defeated, dozens of them, NDP and Liberal MPs, would be guaranteed their pension? Liberal idea or NDP idea?
Whose idea was it to pad your pockets? Was it your idea or was it the leader of the NDP's idea?
So congratulations, Mr. Cooper, on your clip. I hope you can get it up before the end of the meeting.
Just answer the question.
Legislating campus vote. I know that we were not able to do that in the last election because of COVID, but I'd like to elaborate a little, if you could, on the importance of helping students who may be at universities outside of their home.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Mr. Chair, this is to discuss with your committee Bill C65, the Electoral Participation Act.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister for being here. I want to get into the details for Canadians to know exactly how this bill came together in full cooperation with the NDP. I don't want to get too personal, Minister, but do you remember this year on Valentine's Day who you had dinner with?
I do. It was a very romantic moment. I live in New Brunswick. I was in Ottawa. I was away from, obviously, my family. And it was a February night, and we went to a great place called Colonnade Pizza. It's at the corner of Metcalfe and Gilmore. And I went, it's great pizza. I would invite you to go. And my date for that evening was a great guy. You maybe remember him. Daniel Blakey was his name.
Yes, well, thank you. So Daniel Blakey was the lead negotiator for the NDP on this bill. And as a matter of fact, he stood right behind you in March when you made the announcement, and you had said on multiple occasions that this bill was part of the coalition to secure the continued support of the NDP. You even said at the press conference that you gave in response, quote, the Prime Minister and Mr. Singh agreed to these important measures. Question, whose idea? Was it a Liberal idea or an NDP idea to change the date of the election so that soon-to-be defeated, dozens of them, NDP and Liberal MPs, would be guaranteed their pension? Liberal idea or NDP idea?
Mr. Chair, you'll allow me to correct some of the falsehoods in the premise of that question. You referred to a coalition. I know your leader's office wants you to keep using that phrase. We don't have a coalition with the NDP. It's called a supply and confidence agreement. Mr. Blakey wasn't the lead negotiator. I'm surprised you're using union terms, Mr. Duncan. That's great to see the Conservative Party has embraced the labor movement. Mr. Blakey was a partner with me as we developed this legislation, something that our leaders agreed to transparently in a supply and confidence agreement that was posted on the internet. So I know that you look for secret sort of meetings. The Valentine's Day dinner was so secret, we posted it on Twitter, and our leader...
So, Minister, here's the thing, is that we just got information minutes before this meeting started of, in fact, secret meetings that did take place only after Conservatives asked. We found information here that on January 25th, that there was NDP headquarters representatives that got a meeting with the Prime Minister's office, staff from your office in Elections Canada, to get information and briefings behind the scenes, only revealed afterwards. Do you think it's appropriate that the NDP, not just MPs, on two different occasions, NDP party headquarters staff got access to the Prime Minister's office and to Elections Canada to get briefings that were not offered to any other party? I don't think Canadians find that very funny, and it was secret until we asked for details.
Again, you're a very experienced sleuth here, Mr. Duncan. I would congratulate you for that investigative work. This is absolutely normal. So do I think it's appropriate? Absolutely. Do I think it's normal in a Westminster parliamentary system where there's a supply and confidence agreement? Of course it is. These were routine meetings of senior officials of the Privy Council office. Mr. Sutherland was in some of these meetings. I was in meetings with Mr. Sutherland and the Chief Electoral Officer himself, where Mr. Blakey was present, so we could understand the advice both of the Privy Council officials and Elections Canada, as we work together to develop this legislation. So you find it shocking that parliamentarians work together in a collaborative way. We think it's something that Canadians would find very positive.
What Canadians would not find positive is that NDP party headquarters staff were invited and attended those meetings. That is completely inappropriate of what happened there, where one political party was given access to information and documents and crafted a bill. But I'll go back again. The whole point that now the NDP absolutely wants to ignore and forget about was the changing of the election date. Was it a Liberal idea or an NDP idea to move back the election by a week so it guarantees any defeated Liberal and NDP MPs their pension? Whose idea was it? The Liberals or the NDP?
So again, you're a very clever clip you just got for some post that you may do later. But I think it's important for people to understand that pension entitlement had nothing to do with that decision to move the date. I'm lucky enough, I was elected in 2000, so it certainly wasn't my idea to be concerned about pension entitlement for myself. We think that Diwali is an important moment for a very significant community in Canada. There are municipal elections in the province of Alberta on that date. We worked with Elections Canada on a number of different scenarios of different dates. But as I said, Mr. Duncan, in order to reassure you that the little premise of your question, which you fabricate, wasn't the case, we would welcome this committee's judgment in moving the date and would welcome that when you get to the clause by clause, feel free to work with colleagues if you're so outraged and you want to explain why Diwali or the municipal elections in Alberta aren't important. Go ahead. But anytime you move the date, you're going to bump into a problem somewhere.
And here's the thing, Minister, is that it's not about Diwali, because what happened was when you moved it back a week, it then coincided with a territorial election and overlaps into Quebec. What you could have done was move the election earlier if that was truly the reason, and it's not. It's about securing the pensions by giving the election happening a week later. People know that because even just last week we heard when we asked your own officials, why don't you call it earlier, including into the summer? And it was, quote, the sorts of considerations that were made, you wouldn't want to break with summer holidays through Labor Day. That was the reason your officials said it didn't get moved earlier. So, Minister, I'll ask you, you don't want to have an election that coincides through Labor Day. When was the last time that happened?
I haven't taken note of every election. I remember one.
Let me
you asked me a question.
It was the last election.
Either way,
the Prime Minister called it when it was opportunistic for him, and now suddenly you forget when the last election was called.
This is the second time now today that I have had members around this table not respond to my intervention. And you guys are going to flip out in 45 minutes from now, or 40 minutes from now, or 30 minutes from now when I try to end this meeting, because you say there wasn't enough time for the minister. Respect the authority of the chair to try to operate the meeting in an effective and an efficient manner. Minister, there's no time left for a response. There's no time left for a question.
The Conservative leader has been the only federal party leader that has been unwilling to get his security clearance. I would say, describe it as he's doing a bit of a wiggle worm, trying to get out of it. First, we heard the Conservatives say he can't because he'd be muzzled, but we know that's not true because every party leader other than him has got the security clearance and has received the briefings. We also know that the next excuse that was given was that he already had the clearance from back when he was in the Harper cabinet. We know that's not true because I asked the former clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Wernick, when he was here many months ago, and he said, no, if there's a change in life circumstances or a change in job or every 5 years that those background checks have to be redone. Can we clarify that current Conservative leader does not have top secret level security clearance? Quickly?
That is my understanding, Mr. Turnbull, for the reasons you just enunciated.
Thank you. And the other thing that we've heard from the Conservatives recently is that the background check is too intrusive for them, which is kind of hilarious considering every other person that takes national security seriously would go through the same intrusive background check to be able to get those briefings. Now, the latest version of this is that the Conservatives say, we need to use the threat reduction measure.
Mr. Turnbull, sorry, I've got a point of order. Thank you. Oui, Monsieur Berthold.
Pertinence, Monsieur le Président.
Relevance, Mr. Chair.
As a reminder, we are here on 65 specifically. Mr. Turnbull, if you can try to direct your question to how it is relevant to 65, I would appreciate that. I'll turn the floor back over to you. Thank you.
On the same point of order?
Yes, Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Chair, I recognize it's on C65. However, this is directly related to foreign interference, which is part of the bill. I would also argue that Mr. Duncan brought up party officials of the NDP. Part of this bill is also talking about, sorry, did I interrupt you? I was able to contain my composure. I would suggest you do the same. But Mr. Chair, without being interrupted, Mr. Duncan brought up party officials, and Mr. Turnbull is discussing the Conservative Party, and I suspect the leadership race that has been called into question with foreign interference, so I think it's relevant.
Okay, thank you for your insight, Ms. O'Connell. Mr. Turnbull, I'll turn the floor back over to you.
So now we have the Conservatives saying that, we should just use a threat reduction measure. But wouldn't that be subject to the same limitations in terms of the Security of Information Act? So, in a way, it doesn't get around this idea that somehow the Conservative leader could get a briefing through a threat reduction measure, which would allow him maybe more narrow in scope briefing, but it would still be subject to the Security of Information Act, would it not?
Mr. Turnbull, you're absolutely right. The threat reduction measures, we talked about that earlier in the meeting, allow CSIS officials to brief somebody because of an imminent or an ongoing threat to national security. The information that they would share in a threat reduction measure, for example, with the leader of the opposition, whether or not he obtained a security clearance, would absolutely be subject to the Security of Information Act. What that means in more simple terms is a person who would receive information, highly sensitive information, as part of an authorized threat reduction measure, would legally be bound to keep that information secret. And as you know, Mr. Turnbull, those, in fact, it's a criminal statute, the Security of Information Act. Violation of it brings a criminal prosecution. But it's done very specifically to protect the ability of CSIS to protect human sources. It's to protect their investigative capacities.
Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, you have stated with respect to the clause in the bill that pushes back the date of the next federal election that the reason for that was to avoid a conflict with the holiday. You said that before, you said it at committee, but the date that was selected conflicts with the territorial election in Nunavut. And the chief electoral officer came before this committee and indicated that that would significantly strain electoral resources in Nunavut. So you talked about the holiday being important. I agree it is important. I agree the Alberta municipal elections are important. But do you not think the territorial election in Nunavut is also important? And why is it that of all the dates that were chosen, you chose that specific date?
So, Mr. Chair, Mr. Cooper, I think, identifies again something which I said is an ongoing challenge with a fixed election date. I hope Mr. Cooper in the House of Commons hasn't been using in any of his questions the silly phrase about time being up. Because, Mr. Cooper, you would, of course, want to have an election right now, so you shouldn't be worried about a fixed election date next October. But I'm glad you're turning your attention to that.
In solving this problem, you've created another problem in terms of a date that conflicts with a territorial election, which will have an adverse impact on the territory in terms of conducting two elections on the same date. But, Minister, it does solve one problem, a problem not that Canadians have, but a problem that NDP Liberal politicians have, and that is that soon-to-be-defeated NDP and Liberal MPs who would not qualify for their pension will suddenly collect their pension. They're going to pad their pockets. That's what the effect of it would be, is to pad the pockets of soon-to-be-defeated NDP Liberal MPs. The fact that you profess ignorance of that fact is only because you've been caught, and the fact that you're willing to back down is, again, because you've been caught. Canadians have realized that that is exactly what you did, or tried to do. So I'm going to put the question to you once again, a question you refused to answer when Mr. Duncan asked you. Whose idea was it to pad your pockets? Was it your idea, or was it the leader of the NDP's idea?
So congratulations, Mr. Cooper, on your clip. I hope you can get it up before the end of the meeting.
Just answer the question.
In the premise to your question, you had a series of, again, I find it very arrogant, Mr. Chair, that one would say soon to be defeated MPs. I wouldn't purport to decide how the voters in Edmonton, St. Albert will deal with Mr. Cooper in the next election. There's a certain arrogance, I think, from the Conservatives to say that, first of all, their members who would have, in their obsession with the pension focus, have benefited also. The idea that none of them might risk being defeated is the supreme arrogance I find.
Minister, answer the question. Whose idea was it? Was it your idea? Was it the leader of the NDP's idea? I asked you a very straightforward question. Answer the question.
So, Mr. Chair, we have explained when we introduced the bill that we had worked on this bill with the NDP caucus, as in the case it was Mr. Blakey, with respect to an agreement that Mr. Singh and the Prime Minister made. And we have noticed the manufactured indignation from the Conservatives around this issue. I agree with Ms. Barron to perhaps prevent them from dealing with what we think are substantive and positive issues in this.
When you had your behind closed doors secret meeting with the NDP, we see in response that Al Sutherland attended that meeting, but who in the PMO sat in on that meeting with officials in the NDP?
Again, Mr. Chair, it was such a secret meeting at a great pizza place on Metcalfe that we posted it on Twitter.
Referring to the meeting on January 25th, where the chief electoral officer, among others, met with officials in the NDP. And the question we had asked was, who in the PMO, who in your office was at that meeting, if anyone?
There's 15 seconds left.
So, again, Mr. Sutherland addressed that. He was at that meeting. By recollection, I think the meeting took place in my office in the Confederation building. There was nobody from the Prime Minister's office in that meeting. I certainly don't have a recollection of that. I was working with a parliamentarian from another caucus who shared our objective in preparing this legislation, and we were lucky to benefit from the nonpartisan advice of both senior public servants and Elections Canada. There's no mystery. The Conservatives find it shocking that people would work together to try and improve our electoral system. I don't think Canadians find it shocking that parliamentarians would work together to strengthen our democracy as opposed to try and vandalize it like Mr. Cooper would do.
Okay, thank you.
You said it yourself. It's called the Elections Participation Act. And I want to talk a little bit about the measures that are in this bill that talk about increasing voter participation. And one of the parts that you talked about a little bit, but I would like to get more feedback from you, is on legislating campus vote. I know that we were not able to do that in the last election because of COVID, but I'd like to elaborate a little, if you could, on the importance of helping students who may be at universities outside of their home province, their home riding, the ability to participate in that. We've heard previously that when voters start voting at a young age, they're more likely to continue to vote. So could you elaborate a little bit on the importance of this measure?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Madame Romanado, thank you for, again, focusing on what we think should be a very positive, nonpartisan element of this bill, for the exact reasons you enunciated, encouraging young people on campuses to be able to vote. It's proven to be effective. It's easier for students to vote on campus. I think of Mount Allison University in my riding. It's an undergraduate, largely undergraduate campus. People, I think 30 or 40% of the students may come from New Brunswick, 60% would come from other provinces, a number of them from your province. When I visit the campus, there are students from across the country, obviously international students across the country. Their ability to be able to vote in an October election when they've been on campus, some of them maybe only for a month and a half, is very important. And we think that it shouldn't be at the discretion of a local returning officer, in the case of my riding in Beauséjour. Parliament should clearly express its view that Elections Canada and the returning officers in every constituency have an obligation to ensure that the polls can be accessible on university campuses. There are measures in the legislation around making it easier to get mail-in ballots. I spoke about some of the measures in terms of persons in long-term care homes. Many of these recommendations come, Madame Romanado, as you would know, from Elections Canada itself. Elections Canada does terrific work. It's world-leading and recognized globally as one of the most effective, secure, competent, non-partisan administrators of national elections in 4.5 time zones, in 10 provinces and 3 territories. They do terrific work, including with their provincial counterparts. So we should, as a committee and as a parliament, be very sensitive to the non-partisan suggestions and recommendations that in their judgment they would make. And we've tried to do that as much as possible to validate the great work that they do.